Now we move on to our Muppet of the month, or I suppose Muppets of the month, and this is a light touch Muppet. I should say from the very outset, this is light touch. We're not, for example, blaming people for living where they live. Um,
Yeah.
for example, not being able to afford houses in other parts of the country. But this is the Muppetry, the long-term Muppetry in this country, of people building or having policies of encouraging building on floodplains. Now, as my lovely wife is often wont to point out, the clue is in the name. Floodplains will flood,
Yes.
and she grew up in Northern Ireland in a place where it is quite boggy, and her particular house, it was as many houses are in County Antrim. It was a small farm, sort of what's the word? Small scale farming, often very subsistence with a little bit of selling on as well at local markets. And that farm is placed so specifically in that landscape because it's one of the few places that usually doesn't flood, although sometimes it does. But the point is, she was aware, even though her family aren't farmers, I should say. It used to be a farm, now it's just a house on land. Um, uh, but she was always very aware of what parts of the landscape would fill up and what parts of the landscape, therefore, it was a bad idea to build on. And in recent days, it's been brought to the fore. In the past couple of months, I suppose, through the wettest February on record in this country, in particular, and the subsequent saturation of soil and flooding. That not only have people been building on floodplains for quite a while, um, but also that historically people avoided building there. And I find this interesting. And in that sense, I guess the Muppet is modern Britain, and the people calling Muppets are probably people in the past to say, well, what do you expect? Like, if you build there, you're going to get flooded. And again, the Muppets here are not people who are losing their homes and businesses or having them damaged. But it's interesting how this conversation has led, for example, to right up to the Environment Agency now suggesting that we need to think about building flood appropriate homes on floodplains. Now, I'll hand over to you because you highlighted a couple of really interesting little, well, I suppose historical archaeological tidbits that have come out of the floods, though. So, what caught your eye?
Well, you know, we we Brits, we notoriously we like to talk about the weather.
Hmm.
And boy, has there been some weather to talk about in the last few years. And yeah, I mean, you alluded to the wettest February, which yeah, the Met Office has acknowledged that. But we also had floods before Christmas. I mean, famously, the supposed prime minister visited floods during the general election, but hasn't done since when he hasn't got an election to win. Um, but make of that what you will.
Hmm.
But the point is that uh, the wet weather and the ground saturation has led to floods in areas which don't normally
Hmm.
flood,
Hmm.
but which historically are on floodplains.
Hmm. Hmm.
And particularly new developments on those floodplains, unless they've unless they're hardened in that, you know, you put garages on the ground floor and you move the electrics halfway up the wall rather than have them at low skirting board level and so on.
Hmm.
It causes you know, damage and heartache, and it's really upsetting for everyone, and also leads to financial problems, and you end up with a property that's possibly uninsurable.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that, you know, it's a serious consequence of really not understanding the geography.
Yeah.
People took a punt on, you know, 100-year event flood being a 100-year event flood, not one that happens every 5 years or whatever, which is what we're starting to see now
Yeah.
in some cases. And you know, yes, it is, you know, arguably down to climate change, and the questions that are being posed will only get worse. What is really interesting, though, for me as an archaeologist and someone who's interested in landscapes, is some of the commentary and photography that's been coming out of the floods.
Hmm.
And you know, obviously, uh, this is a byproduct of an unwanted event, and it would have been much better for everybody, if the floods hadn't happened. And one's heart goes out to the people who are whose lives have been damaged and disrupted by this kind of awful, heartbreaking event. If you see your home and your personal property damaged and destroyed by water, but there is, a very small chink of light is it reminds us of landscapes of the past. Seeing some of the photography, and particularly some of the aerial photography, there's some spectacular, and we put links below the line, but there's some spectacular photography, for instance, of the River Severn, the floodplain of the River Severn in the west of England, on the Welsh border. Particularly interesting in pointing up how people in the past understood their landscapes. Are the images of Tewkesbury Abbey standing above the floodplain of the floods of the Severn, where it was built on high ground, where in most seasons it wouldn't be flooded. The same applies in the same things going on in Worcester, where the old town and the cathedral haven't flooded, whereas the racecourse near the river has.
But also actually with some of the broad, so there is a in the links that we were suggesting, there is a Daily Mail link, apologies, Daily Fail, where there's some amazing photography highlighting the Tewkesbury Abbey instance, but actually there's on one of the Twitter feeds from John Press Photog, sorry, Tom
Yes.
Press Photog, sorry. In the background of one of his photos, you can see that there are farms that look relatively old as well that are also above that line, and that won't be by accident.
Exactly as you were alluding to with
Yeah,
your wife's family home in Antrim.
yeah, precisely. Yeah. So between the church and and relatively old farm buildings, by the look of it, there is water. And it's not that this, as you say, that this would have happened all the time, but these people probably learned through bitter experience where to build and where not to build in the past. Also, it's worthwhile saying that in places like in the southeast of England, for example, through into the Wash, reclaimed land through drainage schemes in, I suppose, the Victorian period onwards, a bit earlier, um, would have meant that the historic sites would have effectively quite frequently have been islands for most of the year as well, wouldn't they? Prior to this, so
Oh, well, I mean, I come from East Kent originally, and famously, the area around Sandwich was the Wansome Channel,
yeah,
which was slowly reclaimed partly by natural process, but also by the same kind of Dutch water engineers who came over in the late 17th, early 18th century and
tulips,
began
yes.
to
So
put in the system of drainage dikes and so on.
yeah.
Talking of
Sorry,
talking of
I should explain
go
this
on.
for people who don't know. I said tulips because that area is also now well known for flower growing, for example. So that's one of the reasons
Yes.
why the Dutch
Yeah.
were invited in for that, for their experience in cultivating that sort of landscape. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, but the other um, uh, spin-off from this, and it's not to do with the deliberate landscape use of the landscape, but for settlement or or water engineering.
hmm
It's little commentaries on known historical events.
hmm hmm
Battle of Sedgemoor, um, the which was the final battle in the rebellion of the Duke of Monmouth against King James II. I think 1685.
hmm
The battle hinged on a lost channel called the Bussex Rhine
mm
across Sedgemoor in North Somerset.
mm
The Bussex Rhine held up the Duke of Monmouth's army as he was staging a night march to try and attack the Royalist army and take them by surprise.
hmm
It held up his army. The Royalist cavalry crossed the Bussex Rhine, and flanked him, and his army was forced to retreat and collapsed and forced to retreat.
Okay.
So it's a hinge point of a major turning point in English history. Really, if James II had been overthrown,
hmm hmm
it would have been a major moment. And the Bussex Rhine has reappeared in the current sodden landscape.
Yeah,
A local historian noticed it and has photographed it and published it on Twitter.
yeah, yeah,
So we can now see exactly where it was and where this particular piece of action happened.
yeah. That's Steve
So
Carter's Wall Walks, or at Wall Walks on
yeah,
Twitter. Steve Carter's
indeed,
Twitter
yeah,
Twitter feed, and 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 and, and therefore I would once again just reiterate, this is not uh, this is not um, a harsh Muppet of the Month. This is light touch, and we are specifically talking about, and we include ourselves in the category of folks who are part of a society that choose to build in places where historically we did not build, and the fact that I mean, yeah, the very fact that in that sense hydrology is one of the heroes here, or one of the heroes is the wrong word, one of the standout studies of topics of study here, because the fact that that river probably exists now below the ground most of the time on the rock strata, but has come to the surface is of note and is very interesting.
yeah,
So I think we've managed to walk that path very carefully because we definitely don't. I'm not remotely finding any humour in people's
no,
situations. Um, but it's also actually to end on a slightly humorous note. It reminds me of one of Liv's criticisms of British housing when she came here when she was visiting. It was it was a little bit cold. It had been colder as well just before she arrived, um, and uh, obviously living in Sweden, they build for the cold. They build appropriate,
go
architecture.
for the
So,
climate. Yeah,
so for example, you don't have water pipes on the outside of your house because they'll freeze. And she was looking at the way we build in Britain. She's like, you seem to be living in denial of like the fact that you're going to get sub-zero temperatures. What are you doing? And I was like, I don't know, it's just the way we've always done it. I just don't know. I don't. And it reminds me that the British have a weird quirk in terms of we we we. We have to on this island. We have to try and be ready for a range of different weathers, and but it reminds me though that in some cases we should be building appropriately. And so actually, the fact that the Environment Agency is making statements along the lines that we should be building houses on floodplains, where, for example, the garage is on the bottom floor, the kitchen and living room on the so ground floor first on the first floor, um,
yeah,
as opposed, what I mean, one floor up, um,
yeah.
is of note and also noteworthy. In so much as it's good. It that's the funny thing here is that Liv would say, well, obviously, yes, you have to build appropriately. That's more or less what she was saying. She was just amazed at how our houses are built, basically. So go on.
No, I was just going to say to just to finish. Obviously, she's absolutely right, but I think we have to acknowledge, and here I would be critical of the property developers
Hmm.
who put houses that aren't hardened against the possibility of flooding on floodplains, and they don't harden them because it will be more expensive,
Yeah,
and they couldn't just do a standard off the plan development,
yeah,
and the local planning authorities who let them get away with it,
yeah,
and the people
yeah.
who suffer are the people who buy the houses.
Well, and crucially, who are paying the cost of that extra expense now? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Hmm.